Hi, good morning, everybody. Well, I'm sure you enjoyed the session this morning. You had a great discussion at the panel, moderated by my colleague Nick, and the panelists. I think many of us are still here. And as you heard, the panel discussion this morning focused a lot about the why. Why is it necessary for us to prepare the Maritime Task Force in this transformation, given what's happening, the decarb and the digitalization developments. The discussions that I'm going to have with my panel now is talking a little bit more on the what and the how. So we have got an hour, we've got a lot of things to cover, but if I could perhaps just allow me a short while to kind of paint a little bit of the context and perhaps a little bit of the thought process about how we curate this particular panel and the esteemed panelists that we managed to get on board today. So I think as we all know, our industry is going through a lot of change, and all of us have a collective interest, I would say, as well as a shared responsibility to make sure that we prepare ourselves, and particularly preparing our workforce, in undergoing this whole transformation. And as we embrace technology and sustainability, two big words, there's still a lot of unknowns, what it actually means, and how do we start, getting ourselves tuned in, and very importantly, our colleagues, particularly our seafarers on board the ships, as well as our colleagues on shore, to prepare for this. So there are 4 questions that we are looking to address in this panel. Number 1 is, what are the transition and future skills that we need to equip the Maritime Task Force, both at sea as well as ashore? That's the first question. The second one is focusing a little bit on our folks on board the ship, the seafarers. How do we prepare them to safely operate the ships? How do we prepare them to, manage the new technology that we are placing on board the ship? And that's going to be a lot more going forward, as we all know. The third question, perhaps from the perspective of the ship operators, the ship owners, the managers, as in, how do we better achieve stronger and better integration between ship and shore, right? How do we create pathways for seafarers to transition to perhaps shore-based jobs? And conversely, how do we prepare our shore-based colleagues to have the opportunities to have some sea experience and exposure as well? So that's quite an interesting bit in terms of this whole seashore integration. And the fourth area we are hoping to get a little bit of perspective as well is probably a very big challenge, I would call it, which is really around attraction of maritime industry. Attraction for seafarers and attraction for people to come into maritime, whether it's young folks or experienced folks, because as we all know it, we are already facing, I would say, a pretty acute shortage of good people. So how do we enhance attractiveness of maritime jobs by providing more sustainable career pathways? So these are the 4 questions, a lot to cover, which we will endeavor to cover in this session. So maybe I will just give a brief interview, explanation about the people I have on this panel. Mr. Zhang Xiaojie. Zhang Xiaojie comes from the IMO. He's been here this week, and it's very glad to have a senior personnel from IMO to talk a little bit to us. We have 2 representatives from the Maritime Just Transition Task Force. I'm sure that some of you are familiar with it. Bjorn Hoshgaard from Anglo-Eastern, and Marta Servin sitting next to me, who plays a very key role in the task force. Maybe a little bit about the Maritime Just Transition Task Force, which SMF is also a program member. It is dedicated to promote safe and fair transition for seafarers as the whole industry seeks to decarbonize with a time frame of 2050. And last year, in November, it published a 10-point action plan. I'm going to ask Martha to talk a little bit about that shortly, and really how we can support the seafarers and how do we strengthen the global training standards among many important items that came out from the report. And sitting right over there is Dr. Sharin Othman. I think many of you know Sharin, a very well-known personality here in the Maritime, Singapore. Our SMF has collaborated with DNV, where Sharin comes from, on a white paper. It's a very interesting white paper. We're going to publish it after this panel. It is called The Future of Seafarers 2030. So a little bit shorter time frame to the Just Transition Task Force 2030 and what it means. And I'm going to ask Sharin to give a little bit of a sneak preview of the white paper first, in the next hour or so before the report is being published. And lastly, right in the middle, we have got Mr. Goh Tia Yong from Ernst & Young. Tia Yong works very closely with SMF. We have developed a job redesign paper. The SMS Chi alluded to that just now. It is really things that we can do now, not even 2030 to 2050, something we can do now, on how we, kind of facilitate this whole transition. So it's a very interesting piece of work, and I'm going to ask Tia Yong to share a little bit about it. Yeah. So that's I try to keep it brief, but not too brief introduction because there's a lot of things to cover. But I probably going to start off with the first question and to Bjorn. So Bjorn, maybe to set things in context, you can give us a bit of your assessment. How do you see the state of affairs with regards to seafarer preparedness today? Given new ships, new fuels, new technology. I would love to have your perspective on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And let me first say good morning, everyone, and thank you to MPA and Beng Chi for inviting me to be part of this. It's great to be back in Singapore after some very dark years, and I see a lot of old friends and colleagues here. Singapore's got a very special place in my heart, and I'm really enjoying being back for an action-packed week. Looking at the challenges around seafarers' preparedness, I want to start by saying I'm a real optimist. I mean, when I see our young people and see how technologically savvy they are, I feel we are well placed for the challenges ahead. I mean, there's always been progress, since the days of Magellan, and every generation has had to cope with the challenges of the future, and I think we're going to do very well for the next decade ahead as well. But in tune with the overall theme about from ambition to action, we also have to acknowledge that it doesn't come by itself. We have to put in place real steps to attract and develop the right talent for the future. And I can say that for Anglo-Eastern, we have our own cadet program. We train more than 500 cadets a year into our own academy. We're fortunate to have more than 20,000 annual applicants for these 500 seats. And that, of course, comes through a concerted effort about actually going out there and inviting people in to give them access to this career and providing a continued career and training platform for them to go through their maritime lives. It starts there. It then goes on to actually making sure they have good jobs and that they gain increasing knowledge and skills and development. We make sure that each person goes through a 2 to 3 hour training before promotion to next rank, and there's a lot of continued training education around, hard skill specific issues. That could be new fuels, that could be new tools, etc. But also around the sort of soft skills that are increasingly important, which the last panel also talked about. But overall, I would say that I actually think our industry is well placed for the challenge of a decade ahead. That's going to be very different from the decade in the rear mirror, but exciting and very doable, I think.
Well, yeah, you're a great optimist, Bjorn. Great to hear, reassuring. But we can stretch it a little bit. If from perspective of a ship manager, right, Anglo-Eastern is a very big company. What would you define as your 3 key priorities in terms of training required for the seafarers?
Well, so when I think about ships and I look at the majesty of our industry, I actually always come back to that the real magic happens with the people, right? So we got 32,000 people on the books, managing almost 700 ships in full management and supporting crew management for another 250 ships or so. And I think what's easy is to sort of get bogged down in these big numbers and fail to realize that what's really at the core of this thing is how do we unleash each individual's full potential. And I think we can talk about specific training and hard skills, soft skills. We can talk about this learning mindset and the growth mindset that was touched a little bit about in the previous panel as well. But I think one of the sort of key ways I look at this is that if you can get people to have healthy minds in healthy bodies. So if you have people with good nutrition, good exercise, good sleep, and good social relations. And then you, through competence building, give them mastery of their profession. You give them a sense of purpose by understanding how what they do fits into the bigger picture, how what they do serves a purpose outside of themselves. And lastly, a level of autonomy to do this in a way that allows them influence about how and by which means to get to the results. I think you will then see by these sort of 7 building blocks I just mentioned, you unleash an inner motivation and an inner accountability in each individual that takes them to the next level. So I think some of those more holistic considerations about the challenges we have and say, let's try and fit that into that framework, I think is really, really important. And then addressing it one by one, rather than thinking about, we got millions of people that need upskilling, or some people say we need 800,000 people to be upskilled for the new fuels. I think you change the world person by person, day by day.
Yeah, great to hear. I mean, hard skills can be taught, new competencies we need to identify. Yeah, but I think what I'm hearing from you is you can kind of link the mind and the heart, right? I mean, and you give them a sense of purpose. Build it up. People take ownership. They want to change, right? And they want to learn. I think that's a great perspective of things. Martha, if I can go to you and I want to ask you to share a little bit of the work the great work that's been done in the Maritime Just Transition Task Force, and in line with very much the theme of this conference, action, action, action. So, 10-point action plan that your task force has come out. Can you elaborate what are the top priorities of these 10-point action plans?
Yes, certainly. May I also just start with thanking the organisers for having me and just saying how energised I am after that last panel. It's been such an incredible week, but that last panel was really, I feel like it's Monday again, so thank you for that. So indeed, I'm here representing our Maritime Just Transition Task Force, which is actually the first task force dedicated to a just transition in any sector. And it's something that we launched a year and a half ago with the ITF, so the seafarer unions, with the ICS, shipowner representatives, alongside our colleagues at the IMO and the International Labour Organization and us at the UN Global Compact. And the reason we launched this task force is because we felt that the discussions on decarbonisation, on the green transition, had been very finance heavy, and we weren't really discussing, well, what are the skills, what are the competences, who are the people that we need to get us through this transition, and how can we make this transformation in a way that leaves no one behind. So that's how we launched our task force. And one of the first things we did was actually to work with colleagues at D&V to put together a report to kind of understand how many seafarers might need to be trained in different kind of decarbonisation trajectories. So Björn's already alluded to this, but in one of the decarbonisation trajectories, which models a Paris Agreement scenario, we see that potentially 800,000 seafarers might require some kind of additional training by the mid-2030s. But regardless of the scenario, we know that hundreds of thousands of seafarers will require some kind of additional training by 2050. So that much is clear. So that indeed led to the development of, well, what are we going to do about this? Exactly, ambition to action, our 10-point action plan. And I want to talk about 3 of the priority areas from that action plan, and particularly what we're going to be doing to take these forward in our next phase. So one of the key things is about training, fair access to training, making sure we have the training infrastructure in place to support the training of seafarers with respect to decarbonisation. And here, one of the things that we want to do moving forward is to really support getting that training, baseline training framework in place for decarbonisation, both for seafarers, but also for maritime education and training providers. And here we'll be working even closer with the IMO moving forward on this to develop training materials. The second thing, and this was alluded to in our previous panel, and also indeed by His Excellency in his fantastic introduction as well. We need to work closer with governments, and we need to see how we can get these well-functioning tripartite mechanisms up and running, not just in Singapore, but also in other key seafarer labour supply countries. So here is a task force. We've been engaging quite a lot already with the government of the Philippines, of course, one of the key providers of seafarers, to really see how they can have a future-proof, ready structure which can do all the amazing things that we've already been hearing about that's happening in Singapore in terms of skills forecasting, skills mapping, career pathway mapping, feeding international curricula. So making sure that we have these structures up and running in other seafarer supply countries will be a key priority moving forward, but also working with potentially new markets. I actually was in Accra a few weeks ago in Ghana, really engaging with some of the maritime authorities there about what kind of structures might need to be in place to enable African seafarers to also participate in these new green jobs of the future. And I'll be going to Kenya next week, busy, to also have similar discussions. So also making sure that we're engaging on that level as well. And the third thing that we want to do moving forward, and this has been, of course, referenced throughout, but I just want to come back to it again, and we will talk about it again, recruitment and retention, but looking at it from that global perspective. And here, on the one hand, it's perception. We spoke about the image deficit, but it's also about genuine change. So way things are perceived, but also how can we make changes? And I think these will be really important. So here, one of the things we want to do is really look at root causes. So why are people leaving? What is different about the reasons people are leaving from different geographies? So really having that global perspective on that. Getting a good understanding of what best practices are when it comes to recruitment and retention, and not just in shipping. Also, what are other sectors doing? You might hear, live in the UK, and I'm constantly confronted with adverts for join the offshore wind industry, 100,000 new green jobs. Shipping is at the heart of the energy transition. Shipping is at the heart of the green transition. This is something that we need to be thinking about using when we're engaging with young people and when we're engaging in recruitment. And finally, I'll stop here. I feel like I'm also overrunning. Also providing that global framework to be able to coordinate between different kinds of national recruitment campaigns. What are some countries doing well? What aren't some countries doing well? And what can we learn from together to really make sure that we have a global strategy when it comes to addressing this critical issue? Thank you.
Thanks, Martha. That's very insightful and passionate as well, just like what we heard from the 2 ladies just now too. Well, training, right? Collaboration across how do you better attract and retain, and of course, as you said, how do we really build up the entire framework, to make this industry really attractive. So we spoke about lifelong training, and if we can kind of reverse it the other way around, so important for us to be long life, because we're really talking about sustainability. And it's a long game that we are playing. So, the Maritime Just Transition Task Force looking at 2050 kind of time frame, but we all know we need to do a lot more now, in the mid game and the long game. Well, I would next go to Shireen. And Shireen, we are eagerly awaiting the white paper. I got a sneak preview of it just a few days ago. But perhaps you can share a little bit about the key findings of the white paper that the DNV has done, and what's kind of particularly striking that you would like to bring forth to our audience here today.
Yes, thank you, Wing Yu, and morning, everyone. And it's a great event to have this discussion. Indeed, like what Martha mentioned, that the earlier work that was done by DNV, really looking at a bit more further at 2050. and understanding the bigger kind of landscape that the industry will face. However, we felt that being in Singapore, we have to be a lot more practical, putting things in action. So we look at 2030. What does it mean for us within the industry? So the white paper initially talked about the energy transition. Of course, 2050, we have a lot of potentially new fuels like green methanol and green ammonia. But looking at 2030, we like to be realistic. What will be the fuels that will be available in 2030, and what does it mean for the seafarers? So we talked a bit about, of course, LNG, that has a high take-up in the past, just last, 12 months. Also, with regards to adoption of battery, whether full electric or hybridization. The other aspect is also to talk about the digital technologies. We've seen a lot of new technologies, whether by startup or by leading companies like, Wärtsilä or Kongsberg, being introduced, and what could then be the implication of it. But I thought the third chapter was also quite important to look at it, because it's really looking at where do we see ship management in 2030. We talk a lot about the seafarers, right? But the seafarers needs to have an interface. So the interface for the seafarers is the ship management companies. And this is where also we look at the trends coming up with the development of shore control centers. And just maybe about a month ago, I led a study group, a delegation from Singapore, consists of SIT, MPA, and other stakeholders such as ASME and the Coastal Submarine Alliance. So we see for ourselves. We were on board the zero emission and autonomous vessel. So when we realized that, of course, most people think that autonomous vessel will only be decades away. But it's nice to be physically on board such a vessel in Norway and to see. And then we went to the Masterly Remote Control Center, where they are already monitoring 3 vessels, operate autonomously, though they have this crew on board for the purpose of doing this transition to make sure then that things are done safely. So it is through recognizing the trends and seeing what is already happening now and making a projection of what we expect to see within the next few years. And through that, looking at the prism of what are then the training possibilities that we have now, looking not just at SMA, but having appreciation also, like what Martha said, about other training centers outside Singapore. And then what then could it mean with regards to the training, but also on attraction and retention. And through this study, we also did a survey, which, thank you for those companies that have extended, their seafarers for us to conduct the survey. More than 500 seafarers participated. So the question on the key findings I'll bring you, I think something interesting is then that 80% of the seafarers responded then that one of the most very important part of training is on-board mentoring and on-the-job training. So not even we talk about the hard skills or soft skills, right? So this is the perspective of the seafarers themselves. So it's not just about going for training institute, but the expectations. What they think is key important is on-board mentoring and on-the-job training. And then the other question that we asked, about how equipped are the officers, with regards to providing coaching, providing on-job training on board. 60% of them responded in that they are only partially or only have limited in terms of training that they have about coaching, about on-job training. So you can already see the deficit with regards to the expectation of the seafarers and the officers on board not having that, train enough, feel confident enough, exposure enough, how they should do it on board aspect, right? And if you then link that with regards to attraction and retention, 70% of the officers felt then that a better pay will ensure then that they will retain, and they will be attracted, continue to be in the industry. And of course, seafaring, ship management is a cost game, right? I mean, everyone needs to be competitive. So if then that's being, equalized into the whole discussion, then we really need to ensure some of the basic fundamentals, retaining the officers by making sure then that, they are compensated well, focusing on their soft skills so then that they can provide the guidance on board, right? And then the element about focusing also the training of the senior officers. So then that when they are trained, they are confident, they will cascade it down through the crew on board. So these are some of the key findings that, of course, we didn't anticipate, in terms of the perspective of seafarers. Our Prism always look at it from the perspective of, what we think the training should be. Just one more thing also then that maybe this is on the positive side. 2/3 of the seafarers, feel then that onboard technologies will make their job easier. So going back to what Martha mentioned, is about the need for us to share, to create more awareness. There's a lot more new technologies being put on board, and hopefully that create a perception that it's not just menial work on board, right? Technology will make their jobs easier, and 50% of the officers feel then that introducing of new technologies, such as new fuels, showing then that the industry is looking towards sustainability, will be a key aspect of making sure then that seafaring is an attractive job. That they are part of that energy transition, no? We are part of that solution. So an area then that we definitely need to do more, but at least from the survey that we've provided, that is where we should focus on. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharin. Well, before I let you go and go to the next question, can I ask you to, from a classification society perspective, and also from the inputs from the survey, where do you see perhaps the 3-4 gaps, salient gaps today on the seafarers? If you can give us a bit of perspective on that, then it helps us to perhaps collaborate a little bit about, the kind of training that will be required. Can you tell us 3-4 key gaps that is pertinent to you from a class society perspective?
What we've seen, of course, the development on the 2D, the decarb and digitalization, is moving fast within our industry. However, in terms of the training, in terms of the courses that are available out there, may not always be able to catch up. Part of it is, of course, then that could be some of those trainers within the institute themselves. They may not yet also be exposed to some of these new technologies. So there's a need to look at these the courses that are in place out there. But also I'd like to allude to the work that's been done by my colleague within the MTF. So they have identified, 4 areas within STCW that needs to happen. For example, about the regulatory uncertainties. Of course, things are happening. So there needs to be a clarity, a lot more certainty. And through that, looking at the current cost models. But I guess an area that we see a gap is then that there is, the technology is there. But to invest on this technology as part of the activities of the cost providers, it requires a lot of investment. But the money is not there to invest on the training facilities as much as we could, especially not in Singapore, but especially, let's say, in the regional countries. So as what was mentioned, I think, by Martha, significant number of seafarers coming outside Singapore. So that aspect would be one of the biggest gaps that, we need to really be willing to invest, incentivize, the training providers to invest into new kind of courses, so then that it gives access to the seafarers for what they need to be trained to be prepared for the future.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we have identified the core group that we need to address. The question is now, what do we need to do, and what are the upfront actions that we need to put in place? Yeah. Maybe I get to Jia Yong, and I'm going to hit you with 2 questions straight away, Jia Yong. One is that, in the job redesign pilot project that EY did, can you give a perspective, what are your key observations about the maritime sector in terms of adoption of technology? Because you do a lot of work, not just for maritime, but other sectors. But for maritime specifically, how is it that in terms of the, ability or lack of to adopt technology? And secondly, we chose the 2 roles in maritime, important roles, I would say, or most critical roles, technical superintendent and also vessel operator and job redesign. Well, we're not going to stop in these 2 roles, right? So perhaps you can give an assessment, why were these 2 roles selected, and perhaps what will you be looking at, going forward, other roles, perhaps?
Thanks, Meng Yu, and thank you, organizers, for allowing me the opportunity to be here. Good morning, everyone. So maybe if I could set the context before I answer Meng Yu's question directly. Panelists, and in fact, the whole week we've been talking about a few macro trends, right, or mega trends, if you will, right? We've been talking about technology, sustainability, and decarbonization. We've been talking about digitalization and talent scarcity. So against that backdrop of these mega trends, and focusing specifically on shore-based roles, and I'll explain why a little bit more. We wanted to tackle, in this pilot study, a few problem statements. The first problem statement is this: how will these mega trends transform the way job roles onshore are going to look like in the short term, in the midterm, in the long term, right? So we are not thinking just 2030 and beyond, we're thinking immediate term, because there is an urgency for these roles to transform immediately. The second problem statement we wanted to tackle was, if you look at the traditional pathways of sea to shore, when we look at the seafarers coming into some of these job roles, what career pathways are possible onshore? Because we know that our seafarers have different life cycle needs. You know, they might not, at some point in time, want to stay out in the sea. They might want to come back onshore. How do we keep them in the industry at different stages of their life cycles? So we wanted to look at that and say that, are there opportunities for them, depending on what their seafaring experience is, to come onshore and still contribute meaningfully in shore-based roles and have pathways to succeed in various parts of your respective organizations? So that's the second problem statement. The third problem statement we wanted to tackle is this, that can, especially here in Singapore, I would say, right, and perhaps other IMCs that are talent scarce as well, can we expand the profile of talents that we look for on shore-based roles? Can we expand the possibilities, right? We know that the issues that we tackle in this industry are increasingly complex. We have to rely more on technology, data. We have to think about decarbonization and sustainability. We have to inject fresh perspectives into the industry. So how can we broaden the talent profiles that come onshore? How can we perhaps rethink some of these previously thought of as hard-coded seafaring experience that are needed in order to perform well in some of these onshore job roles? So those were the problem statements that we wanted to tackle. And we zoom in specifically on those two job roles, vessel operators as well as technical superintendents, because today, I believe in most of your organizations, these are perhaps the key salient opportunities where seafarers can actually come on shore. But as I agree with you, Bing-Yu, it doesn't stop there, right? When we think about job redesign, the principles underlying job redesign have to apply to all roles, whether they are onshore or out in the seafaring community, the job roles that we have out there on our vessels. So when we think about job redesign, the traditional or the usual response I get to that is, oh, it seems like something new, it's a new concept, it's innovative. I want to correct that. Job redesign is something that all of us as leaders, we have always been doing. We just never really called it that. We called it something else, right? We called it continuous improvement. We called it coaching our people. We called it upskilling our people. The reality is, if we don't do job redesign in a structured manner, if we don't know what kind of problems we're trying to solve, and we can't give a good illustration of how these job roles will transform, our people have anxiety. They don't know what skills they need moving ahead. They don't know how they will perform their work and how they will embark on different ways of working moving ahead, and they don't have that confidence that they will succeed moving ahead. So I think job redesign is needed, not just for these two roles that we did in this study, but in fact across the entire industry. And you know, as we say here in Singapore, I'm about to sell some koyok. I'm about to peddle my wares. There is a guidebook that will be released later this afternoon, and I encourage everyone to look at it to understand sort of how job redesign can be applied in your respective organizations. And we can speak more about that later on.
Thank you, Jia Yong. Yeah, I'll come back to you for a little bit more koyok later. But if I can just get to our IMO, yeah, and Xiao Jie, if you can give us the perspective of IMO, what can be done on the global scale? I mean, Martha referred to the global scale, to prepare our maritime workforce from sea to shore for all these changes that we are seeing.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer to give me the chance to sit here to share some of my thoughts with you. And it was an exciting week. From Monday, we have been listening to the innovations, initiatives of what we are doing to face the challenge of digitalization and decarbonization, as well as other elements that infect our industry. But today, we come back to the very essential elements of human factor. And I think this is the very basic elements for our future and the enabler of a sustainable development of the maritime industry. IMO's long-term strategy recognize the safety of life at the sea, the protection of environment protection, the protection of marine environment, and international trade. All depends on the competence and professionalism of personnel employed and engaged to the maritime industry, and to support the digital and the green transformation of the international shipping. The industry still needs to attract and retain the most competent personnel to fulfill their responsibilities for this industry. In that regard, IMO needs to work very closely together with stakeholders of the maritime industry. From IMO's perspective, this may include in the working process of adopt of a new or amend existing regulations regarding seafarers training and protection of seafarers' well-being that will include a lot of relevant issues that need to take a holistic approach. Well, not only we are mentioning that the seafarers training, certification, and watchkeeping, but also we need to take into account the significant transformation will entail some other critical issues for the seafaring profession. There's a lot of speakers have already mentioned that the challenge that we are facing, including the issues of with the human-centered design, automation, alternative fuels, and new technology advancement, and we are coming to an age of data-driven process. All this need to be considered within the greater picture of seafarers' competence and their well-being. But at the same time, I do think we are also welcoming a good opportunities for the maritime industry to strike a better gender balance in this way of coming, they change from the very traditional seagoing navigation profession to a hybrid automation, digitalized, the remote controlling way of transportation. On top of that, there's also a good sign that we may have a better chance to attract the youth to this very challenging but very significant profession of maritime industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Seo Chia. I think certainly industry is looking forward very much to the leadership from IMO and working very closely. I think there's a lot of things to be done, perhaps even a review of the existing protocol and framework, on STCW, COC conventions and stuff like that. So still look forward very much to working very closely with IMO in driving all these changes. If I can, I'm looking at the time, I can just shift gear a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about, lifelong learning, or, giving a holistic experience to the people. I'd like to refer to Beyond. From the seafarer's perspective, sort of giving them a career beyond the sea, if they choose to do so. If you want to continue to sail, fantastic. But if you want to have a career, but in the office, what can we do? What can we do to transition them to shore-based role and equip them with new cultures, new type of responsibilities? If you can help us to give a quick perspective of the key priorities that we can do.
Yeah, I think you prefaced it well by saying there are large numbers of seafarers who don't want to come ashore, who are very content with getting up through the ranks and serving as senior officers and living a life from that career point. But there are also seafarers who wish at some point in life to pursue a career ashore. In Anglo-Eastern, more than 80% of our vessel managers and senior managers have actually sailed with us. So it's sort of getting that pipeline to work for you is a key part of our DNA, and I think it's worked extremely well for us, and I think it's something that more companies can pursue. That being said, things are changing, and it's not necessarily the best way to do it going forward. Just to take people, people used to do 15 years at sea and then come ashore. We can see from our numbers over the last decade that they now come ashore after 11 years at sea. So it's a shorter period before they come ashore. And some of the challenges we know exist in that transition is that a ship is a very autonomous, in the sense of closed ecosystem, very steep power structures, and very isolated in many ways. So when people come ashore, we assume they understand how to function in a more global 25 officers across the globe in a corporate environment, and we expect them to know what good looks like, and they don't necessarily do that, right? So making that easier through some bridging programs, some LEAP programs, is what we are looking at. Teaching people some specifics about what good looks like in that transition, making it easier for them. The other thing I would say here is I think we got some tailwinds from technology. I think an underappreciated fact is that these low Earth orbiting satellites, which are now rolling out with Starlink and OneWeb, etc., we are seeing it. It really changes the game completely. We're going when we install Starlink on a ship, we see the same amount of data in an afternoon that we did in a month before. I mean, it's really significant. And what that technological change means is that people will be much more connected to their family, friends, but also to the office ashore. I mean, a ship will no longer be this isolated bubble. It will be part of the ecosystem. We will have, 700 floating offices out there in the world, but connected the same way that every other office is connected. And in the future, you will see that we have video conferences, not one-on-one with ships, but a vessel manager will sit down and speak to his 5 chief engineers in a conference around what's the program for the next month. Stuff like that. And that is going to break down the steepness of that power structure on board, and it's going to enable people to be much more in tune with the tones and developments of the corporate office, and it's going to ease that transition into a shore-based role. If you had asked me 10 years ago if I would recommend for my children to go to sea, I would have said no. But if you ask me today, and actually I have a son who is just joined the Navy, so at least it tastes a little bit like shipping. I would say yes, go for it. I would love to start a career at sea today. I wouldn't have thought so 10 years ago, but I think that some of the changes we are seeing in shipping with technology and with this, green transition, I think it makes it an exciting and very, very livable place to have a work, to have a job, to have a career, to have a life that is both meaningful and fulfilling in many, many ways.
Thank you very much for that. Great to hear your son is coming on board. I mean, hopefully from the Navy into commercial shipping as well. But yeah, thank you very much for that. Marta, if I can ask you, I know the work that the Maritime Just Transition Task Force is doing is fantastic. We are talking about what 20 years from now and more. But if I can go even further ahead, what will be the next phase? And taking a kind of a holistic look at things, are there plans that perhaps that may come in place that we can set universal training standards between IMO, between ILO, between ITF, for example?
Thank you for that. And I just want to come back on very quickly on something that Bjorn just said, because it made me think of a conversation I had over a lunch a few days ago where someone referred to the chief engineer as being the CEO of a ship, which I thought was quite an ingenious way of describing it. And then going from being a CEO to then going and trying to find your way back into a workforce. So yeah, that just really rung true what you were saying. In terms of your question and universal standards, so one of the things that I mentioned previously is what we want to do when it particularly comes to the training aspect is through a closer work with the IMO to start putting together this kind of baseline training with respect to decarbonisation that can in turn also hopefully feed into the review of the STCW and also potentially form the basis of a model course. So these are some of the things that we're exploring and looking towards in our next phase. But one of the things, of course, universal global approach is really, really important. And here, of course, players like the IMO and the ILO and hopefully the task force play a role. But I just want to come back to one other aspect, which is what I mentioned earlier around these national advisory bodies. And once again, the good example that we have here in Singapore about what can be done when you have this tripartite mechanism working. And talking about this career pathway discussion, I think one of the really important things that these national advisory bodies can do is to look at a national level and see what the different kind of career pathways can be in a given country, because a career pathway in Singapore from sea might be totally different in the UK as in the Philippines, as in India. To give an example from the UK, I was reading a report recently that actually the Maritime UK and their skills kind of commission are actually working with the offshore wind sector to kind of see, well, what kind of cross-sectoral skills from technical to operational can we actually use, and what might a pathway look like between seafaring and offshore wind? So I think once again, these pathways will depend where you are in the world. So having that well-functioning tripartite structure on a national level can really support with that pathway element. And one thing I can't quite resist coming back to the excellent point here made about an opportunity for women. And of course it really is. And if we have these clearer career pathways which show maybe a chapter at sea as part of a longer career, potentially also going on shore, this is obviously going to be really important when it comes to letting 50% of the world into such a fantastic industry. So if we can use career pathways, think about how we can use them to attract more women as well, I think that would be really, really excellent and exciting. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that. We certainly welcome, a lot more of our fantastic ladies into maritime for sure. If I could just kind of pivot a little bit out of maritime, I can ask Tia Yong, give a perspective. How are other sectors? What do they do in embarking this whole workforce transformation? And is there anything that we can learn that we can bring in place to help us, in maritime?
Yep. Thanks, Mingyu. So the mega trends that we talked about earlier, digitalization, decarbonization, sustainability, talent scarcity, they impact every industry that's out there. So those are not unique to the maritime industry, right? Some of the good things that are being done in other industries, which I see us trying to do that as well, and then perhaps we can enhance in those areas are really three aspects, right? One is really thinking very in depth around how our roles are going to transform, how our roles are going to change, right? The ways of working are going to change. Thinking about people, process, technology, and the better confluence on those things, and how our people can perform those job roles in a different manner moving ahead. We have to do that crystal ball gazing, if you will, right? Near term, mid-term, long-term. Again, because that drives confidence that our people understand how they will change in terms of the ways of working. They understand what kind of skills they need, whether we're talking about hard skills or soft skills, whether we're talking about onshore or out in sea. And we then have a better view around, as a tripartite community, with the schools, with the governments, with industry, how do we give these people these skills, right? So I think that's the first key thing that we can perhaps emulate better in industry. Second thing to really think about is the way we train our people, right? Perhaps not just relying on the schools, and of course companies are doing a great job training their people as well, but how do we train differently? How do we leverage technology, virtual reality, AR, micro-learning, all these different aspects? Can a sea officer on the vessel do learning on the job now that we are in the connected world, right? How do they upskill in micro skills, in data analytics, in technology, while they're out at sea? Have we thought about some of those things, right? And I think many companies are already trying these things out and doing these things well. How can we promulgate that on an industry level? So the upskilling and the ways of skilling has to be different as well moving ahead. The third thing that I think we also need to think about is understanding really that our people don't come in one homogeneous block, right? We have those in their youth, in their 20s, 30s. We have those in their late 50s, late 60s. They all have different aspirations. They all have different life cycle needs. They all have different wants and needs, right? So how do we build a career that accommodates for all these different expectations at different parts of their life cycles, so that when they see a career in the industry, when their needs shift, there is something that is still in there for them and that keeps them in the industry for life, right? And they're not just doing one single role in a single way for life. So I think those are some things that we can imbibe, and I'm sure we'll do more of that in the industry moving forward.
Thank you. I'm very cognizant of time. I'm going to round up 2 questions, and this is around Singapore. Yeah, and I'd like to pose the question first to Xiao Jie. From IMO perspective, again, how do you think that Singapore, as a global hub port and an international maritime center, how can we contribute to elevate skills and competency of the maritime task force in this region and also, on the international front?
Thank you. Before I reply you, I would like to take this opportunity to express IMO's sincere gratitude to Singapore's strong support for its technical cooperation and capacity building activities over many years, and especially on the opening day. I'm sorry, His Excellency Mr. Iswaran announced that there's another 5 million package of enhanced training package is on the way. For that, I thank the government of Singapore for their contributions, which benefit a lot by a large number of developing countries, both in this region and globally. Come back to the issue of what Singaporeans' role in the coming decades of transformation in the area of working force and maritime talent. I do believe that with the advantage of Singapore's position, which can attract a lot of maritime talent globally, and it can make full use of this maritime talent to provide better guidance to the industry and play a leadership role in the sense of coordinate and work together with all the stakeholders in producing industrial guidelines, best practice, the sharing, which can not only benefit the maritime sector in this region, but also globally. And then it can also pave the way for the application in the global scale. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, certainly Singapore is very keen to play a role, an enhanced role. I mean, we have got a fantastic ecosystem here, and certainly look forward very much to work with the IMO. And again, on the Singapore subject, Sharin, what contributions do you think that Singapore can play in terms of the training and education of workforce in this region?
Okay, now I got to put on my maritime cluster strategy hat. I think to ensure then that Singapore continue to be leading, I think in the coming decade. I think definitely Singapore have done a lot. I think, for example, organizing the various committee, like the tripartite, advisory panel, definitely, has, proven then that it's an effective way because you are involving the various stakeholders. And normally when we look at developing a cluster, and for example, for Singapore to take also a leading position, not just for Singapore, but also for the world, is to really look at it from an ecosystem perspective, right? So Singapore Maritime Academy have already done a lot, in terms of building up its facilities, capabilities. So nevertheless, I think we can still continue to improve. I think with regards to for example, the training methods, using new technologies such as simulations. A significant majority of the respondents to our survey indicated then that one of the best training method that they felt is through simulation. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is about also having in-person training versus purely computer-based training. They felt that that is a lot more effective than purely computer-based training. And if you look at, like what I say, if you look at ecosystem perspective, there's a lot of crew being changed in Singapore, and I know then that maybe for ship management company to get the crew to spend a couple more days in Singapore, going to be expensive. Hotel is expensive, right? So we need to look at the ability, probably looking at blended training. There's element of doing a remote. And here, and I see one of the questions is a concern about rest hours on board, right? Technology has allowed us to do more like cloud-based simulation. Right? So cloud-based simulation, you don't need to do it on board, you can do it at your home. So combining, and we also got to look at more customization rather than doing a generic training. Everyone, they learn at their own pace. So if we are able to look at a more customized individual cloud-based training to individuals, seafarers knowing their own pace, but then combine that with some in-person assessment or face-to-face training, especially when they are in transit in Singapore, being a large kind of hub for not just for transshipment, but also for crew change, then recognize those training, especially by the regulators, that these are recognized training, then we could, create something new that probably not have seen elsewhere. So I think to answer to that is really the full use of technology. We have Microsoft earlier saying that these are all possible, right? So by combining all of these capabilities that we have, and then setting that as potentially and a framework that can also bring forward to IMO, that other countries that have same access to Wi-Fi technology, and also avoid, if possible, getting the seafarers to, do some of the trainings on board so that they also need their rest time, and do it some of it, as I said, to the comfort of their home. So an area definitely that, we have been really strong as an IMC. So an area that we can now invest into putting together a program that initially we can, let's say, model it here, but then we can also look at it as scale it up. Because with technology, you can easily scale it up, like what we've seen during COVID. So that would be my suggestion, putting on as I said, the Singapore as a leading maritime center head, to also take an active, leading role within this space.
Thank you, Sharin. I think we have time just for perhaps one question from the Pigeonhole. I'm trying to combine some of these questions because there are loads, but perhaps it's really around, our freight folks, the seafarers. And I can combine this question around sustaining experienced seafarer. And the question is that, a lot of the seafarers group here, have fear of advanced technology. And on the other spectrum is, folks joining Maritime. How do we even get them to start their interest, and the cadetship even before they join Maritime? And perhaps I can pose this question to Bjorn.
So I'm not sure that actually seafarers have a fear of technology. And I think it's more about the generations of seafarers. I think, again, as I started saying this morning, the new seafarers I see in our cadet academy, they embrace technology and live technology and in a way where I have a very high degree of confidence of their ability to use technology for progress in our industry. If I just jump back for 1 second to what Singapore and Singapore's role as an IMC, and I know I'm speaking as an outsider here, but I think, I came to Singapore first time in 2000 and lived here for a couple of years, starting my life in Asia. And I think Singapore has really developed into the preeminent international maritime center in the world. Not least because of the model we talked about before with government, unions, and private industry coming together for the common good. And I think Singapore should continue with that. I think Caroline spoke a lot about embracing foreign talent and using that foreign talent as leverage to develop local talent as well. And lastly, I think what Singapore can do going forward is to, from that leadership position, be the tide that lifts all boat in Asia. I think Singapore can lead not just for Singapore, but for all of Asia, and that's an aspiration that I like to see, because I think Singapore really has shown some exceptional leadership, and I know many of you have been part of that journey over the last couple of decades, and for that you deserve a hat tip. But I think Singapore can move from being, IMC for Singapore to an IMC for Asia, and I'd like to leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, maybe I hope could assist to answer that question. Right? I guess in terms of being afraid of new technologies, doesn't apply just for senior officers. Probably it's also applied to us, right? I mean, there's a lot of new things coming up. I'm always learning a lot from my kids, right? In terms of what's going on, within the social media. But this is probably on board the ship going to be a challenge, but we still have to try it. What we call as reverse mentoring, right? So for a seafarer that are experienced, we'll teach the younger one about, let's say the seafaring skills. But for new seafarers that goes on board that are so digitally savvy, could then be doing the mentoring or teaching to the senior officers, right? What are some of the tools that they can use? And I think if we've seen this even in DNV, right? The younger surveyors, things like that, they are really picking up fast on things. So then they create a confidence and show maybe the seniors, how to use some of these tools. So if we can break that hierarchy barrier on board the ship by encouraging the more seniors that are less tech savvy to learn, from the younger one that goes on board that are really, good at it. So probably then you could break that concern about the fear of new technology, and as I said, this is applicable to all, not just for seafarers. So that is just my suggestion, and for this industry going to be more challenging. But if we recognize it, then hopefully companies can take action to mitigate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we kind of ran out of time, but if I can again summarize, lots to do, certainly around people and talent, ginormous task, shipping companies, regulators, the whole industry. But I think certainly there's a very strong desire and, a real strong purpose to really want to get this done well. And certainly, as you heard from my panel, I think here in Singapore, we can certainly play, and we want to play, a bigger role in driving this transformation. So if I could ask the audience here, after this panel, we're going to release the paper that Tia Yong has done on the job redesign. We're also going to release the paper that DNV has done on the white paper on Seafarers Pathway 2030. So please feel free to download the paper. I think you can get a lot more great content there. We can go on forever, but I'll kind of leave you all to read the paper, and perhaps if there's any further thoughts and questions you have, please post to us in SMF as well as also my colleagues in MPA. So with that, thank you very much for your time today, and look forward again to a successful conference. Thank you.